Welcome, everybody. We're very pleased to welcome Rebekah Stroud from the IFS to Manchester this afternoon. Rebekah joined the IFS in 2017 after completing her philosophy, politics and economics degree at Queen's College in Oxford. She's a research economist in the Industrial Organisation and Demand team at the IFS and is currently involved in a research project that studies the effects of advertising on fast food purchases. Before handing over to her, I'd like to share with you a cautionary tale. First thing I should say is I know relatively little, that is nothing, about the economics of the food and drinks industry. But today's topic did remind me of a famous and often repeated story whose source is a guy called Paul Seabright. Paul Seabright is an economist now at the Toulouse School of Economics. And in 2010, he wrote a book called In the Company of Strangers, and I recommend it. It's a great book. In that book, he reports a conversation that he'd had some years before, and he writes the following, so I'll read the quote. About 2 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I was in discussion with a senior Russian official whose job it was to direct the production of bread in St. Petersburg. Please understand that we are keen to move towards a market system, he told me. But we need to understand the fundamental details of how such a system works. Tell me, for example, who is in charge of the supply of bread to the population of London? There was nothing naive about his question because the answer, nobody is in charge, when one thinks carefully about it, is astonishingly hard to believe. So that's what Paul said, and this story has morphed and and you can find it on the internet in a variety of different forms. But essentially the question is, who is in charge of the bread supply in London, and the answer is nobody. The fact that nobody is in charge of London's bread supply, yet there is plenty of bread, is perhaps an instance of Adam Smith's famous invisible hand. So many in the audience, and many joining the audience, may have come across a rather more formal interpretation of the invisible hand mechanism in their first year microeconomics. So who here is a current student at Manchester? Raise your hands. There we are. So we have several. Good. So one of you then can tell me what the first theorem of welfare economics says. Have a go.
All right. I may mix up the first and second, but any efficient allocation.
No, that's a second. Go for the first.
Okay, so
the other one, yeah.
An allocation that is achieved via a market mechanism through competition will be an efficient one.
Excellent. Yeah, well remembered. Round of applause, I think. So loosely speaking, I suppose the fastest way to say it is markets are efficient. Now, we have to say that a little bit more carefully. So if markets are complete and competitive, then the prices that they generate allocate goods and services efficiently. So economists have a very good understanding then of when, why and how markets fail. They fail because they might not be complete, they might not be competitive. So if markets are not competitive, for instance, one side of the market has market power, they have control to some extent over the price in that market, then there's no guarantee that the market price will allocate goods and services efficiently. If markets are incomplete, for instance, there are externalities or what are sometimes called spillovers, or the buyer and seller may have very different information about the quality of the good or service being traded, then there's no guarantee that markets are efficient. And of course, efficiency in itself is not the only objective that society may have when allocating goods and services. It may be the case, for example, that we care about the equity of the allocation. We may care that a market might entirely plausibly generate prices that result in a very unequal distribution of resources. So there is a case, therefore, that might be made for government intervention in a functioning market. There might be a lack of competition, like monopolies. There may be the presence of spillovers or externalities, or we may have equity concerns. Of course, a case for intervention does not by itself justify intervention. Government is not, after all, omniscient. And I'm going to quote twice from Milton Friedman, my favourite economist. So the first one I'm going to use is Milton Friedman said, "The government solution to a problem is usually as bad as the problem." Yeah. Nevertheless, governments got bigger and bigger and bigger in recent history. So roughly speaking, UK tax revenues as a proportion of GDP have grown from approximately 10% throughout the 19th century and before to roughly 20% in the interwar period to 40% post-Second World War. Well, while economists have studied problems of market failure for many, many years, they've invested relatively little in the analysis of the causes and consequences of government failure. After all, would you trust the government to organise London's bread supply? Milton Friedman clearly wouldn't. He said, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years' time there'd be a shortage of sand. Of course, the US government at the time didn't have the benefit of the advice of the IFS, nor today's speaker. So on that note, I'd like to hand you over to Rebekah Stroud, who's going to tell us about whether or not the government should stay out of our kitchens. Rebekah.
Thank you very much for that. So, as has been mentioned, my name is Rebekah Stroud. I'm a research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today we're going to be looking at the question, should the government get out of the kitchen? I've slightly changed the title from stay out, because it implies they're possibly already there. So to begin, every day we make a ton of decisions about what to eat, be that whether to have an apple or a donut, or what and how much to eat for a given meal. And we tend to think we probably make these decisions by weighing up all sorts of factors. We're likely to take into account how much we enjoy these things. And that probably differs from person to person. Perhaps you quite like apples, whereas you quite like donuts. But how much we enjoy these things isn't the only thing that comes into our calculations. We also care about prices, typically preferring things that are cheaper, all else being equal. And also we care about how eating these things make us feel. So eating a healthy, balanced diet makes you feel energized, ready to take on the challenges of the day. Eating too much or too little or too unhealthily can leave you feeling drained, and also give rise to a whole range of health consequences too. And economists typically think that we weigh all these sort of things into account when deciding what to eat. How much we enjoy them, prices, as well as any long-term health consequences. But what you probably think a bit less about when deciding what to eat is all the way that the government is also influencing your decisions. And they're increasingly doing this in a number of ways. So to quickly run you through a few, we've got labelling restrictions. So for a while now, all manufacturers have been required to list the ingredients in a product, as well as key nutrient information. And increasingly there's a move to displaying that in a particularly easily understood way as well, such as through some sort of traffic light color coding system. You've also got restrictions on what can be advertised to you. So for about 5 years now, unhealthy food has not been allowed to be advertised to children on television. And in London, that's just been extended to the public transport system as well. 2 years ago, we also introduced a soft drinks tax in the UK. This increases the price of unhealthy soft drinks when you want to buy that, so that's soft drinks with added sugar. And this isn't current government policy, but there's also talk about introducing a ban on having chocolate and other unhealthy snacks by counters in shops, in kind of spots that we might regard as spots where you're likely to succumb to temptation. It's interesting to kind of investigate our instinctive reactions to these policies. Perhaps you quite approve of the labelling requirements, you find them quite helpful, whereas perhaps you feel a bit more resentful towards the soft drinks tax. Our reactions to these can be informative as to the sort of rationales we understand and accept for government intervention. But before we get on to considering that, let's talk a bit about some of the rationales typically given by politicians or the media for these interventions. And these typically centre around concerns about obesity, and not without good reason. Obesity rates are high and increasing. So the graph I'm about to show you will show the proportion of adults in the UK who are obese and how it's changed over time. So what we see is that it's gone up quite dramatically. Back in the early 1990s, on average, 1 in 6 adults were obese, whereas nowadays that's gone up to 2 in 6, so 1 in 3. This problem isn't also just limited to adults. We also see it in children. If I were to give you a classroom of 10 children, if they were 5-year-olds, so just in reception age, on average, 1 in 10 of them would be obese. If that goes up to 11 years old, we get 2 in 10. And there are a number of reasons why we might be particularly concerned about childhood obesity. Firstly, we observe that actually if you're obese as a child, you're much more likely to be obese as an adult. Your weight status is something which really tracks into adulthood. But also there are good reasons for thinking actually what children eat isn't always a product of their own decisions, but is decided for them, be that at school or at home. There's also an element of inequality to obesity. If I were to give you 2 classrooms now, one in one of the least deprived areas in the UK and one in one of the most deprived, On average, if these were Year 6 students, just over 1 in 10 of them would be obese in the least deprived area, whereas that would go up to just under 3 in 10 in the most deprived area. Insofar as we think obesity gives rise to reduced productivity and is also associated with a whole load of health complications as well, this is likely to compound existing inequalities as well. But we've seen that obesity is on the rise and that it's very prevalent. But do concerns about obesity and its consequences in and of themselves justify government intervention in this area? Well, this depends a bit on what you think the role of policy is. If, for example, you thought that the role of policy was just to improve health outcomes, then you'd probably say, yeah, this does provide a justification for government intervention. That's because policy may well improve health outcomes. But if you understand it like this also seems to imply that the role of government should be to get you to choose the apple rather than the donut every single time. Now, I don't know about you, I'm quite a big fan of donuts, and I quite enjoy eating my donut, and I think that is something that should be weighed into calculations when we consider whether or not I eat that donut. So economists, therefore, are concerned with the kind of different set of questions. Instead, we consider, how does policy change the way that individuals weigh up the costs and the benefits of a given decision? Importantly, we don't just think about the health consequences, be that the positive or the negative health consequences. We think about all sorts of benefits and costs and weigh these up. So on the benefit side, you've got how much you might enjoy a given thing. And then on the cost side, you've not just got the health consequences, but you've also got things like the price, as well as any effects that might have on other people. Understood like this, economists tend to think that policy is justified if it helps people to weigh up the costs and benefits of their consumption better than they would do in absence of the policy. To think a bit about how people make decisions, let's consider an example. So I'm going to give you both Steve Jobs and Beyoncé, both considering the decision to have a donut or an apple. They approach this decision with different preferences. Steve really likes apples. Beyoncé, by contrast, really likes donuts. If this was the only thing they were to take into account, they'd make different decisions. Steve would lean towards the apple, Beyoncé towards the donut. But this isn't the only thing they're going to take into account. They also both know that donuts are bad for them. This, therefore, leads them further towards eating the apple, tilting the scales more in that direction. There's also a price difference between these products, with the apple being cheaper, leading them further towards the apple. Let's imagine for a moment that these are the only set of relevant costs and benefits they need to take into account. So both of them are fully weighing up these decisions. In this case, economists would not say there is a role for policy. That's because they've made fully considered decisions. And importantly, they come to different conclusions. Beyoncé chooses to go for the donut, and Steve goes for the apple. And the reason why there's not a role for government policy in this case is that people are generally good at weighing up their decisions. They know their own trade-offs and their own preferences better than government would. Importantly, understood this way, if Beyoncé were to go on and develop some sort of health complication due to her love of donuts, actually, economists wouldn't say she'd made the wrong decision, because this is something that she'd factored in at the time of making the decision and decided that actually her enjoyment made that risk worth it. But you might think, do people really take all the costs and benefits into account? And actually, that's true. This is kind of where problems arise. So sometimes people do forget to take all the costs of their decisions into account, and this could be costs to themselves or to costs to others. And in this case, policy might well be justified. And to see why, I'm going to introduce a third character to our story, and that's Homer. So, as you probably are well aware, Homer's a big fan of donuts. So if this was the only factor he had taken into account, he'd definitely lean towards the donut. But he too is aware, sadly, that they're not particularly good for him, leaning him more towards the apple. And he faces the same prices, with apples again being cheaper. And actually, when he takes all of these factors into account, he comes to the conclusion that all things together means he would rather have an apple. But now let's imagine for a moment that Homer didn't go to biology class. Homer's unaware of the costs, the health consequences of eating the donut. In this case, he's only weighing up how much he enjoys the donut and the price difference. And in this case, he goes for the donut. But this decision isn't the decision he would make if he was fully weighing up the costs and benefits of his decision. And in this case, we think there is a role for policy. But in order to properly understand that, I'm going to suggest, therefore, there are two key questions we need to address. Firstly, are there costs that people aren't taking into account? Do we see real-world situations, such as Homer, where he's failing to take into account the health consequences for him? And secondly, does policy actually help them to take these costs into account? Because as Chris alluded to, if they fail to do this, then government policy doesn't get us anywhere. So let's begin by considering the first of these. Are there costs that people don't take into account? So I've already kind of suggested the first, probably most obvious reason why people might not take all costs into account. And that's because they're simply not aware of them. They might lack the relevant information. And there's been quite a bit of recent research which has looked at whether or not people properly understand the decisions they're making over what they eat. There might be a number of reasons why they don't. Firstly, they might not know what nutrients are in a given product. Secondly, they might not know what actually a healthy diet consists of. But also, they might have all the information, but just struggle to process it. So a YouGov study has recently compared how healthy people think their diets are and how healthy they actually are by observing what they actually purchase. And what they found is that of people who say they have a healthy diet, so who believe they do, only a small proportion actually do. With 24% having an actively unhealthy diet, remember these are people who think they have a healthy diet, and then the 43% having a pretty average diet, and only a third actually having a healthy diet. So this is definitely suggestive that there's some sort of gap between how healthy people think their diets are and how healthy they actually are. But this isn't the only reason why people might fail to take certain costs into account. We might also think that people experience lapses in self-control. We've all had the moment of walking into our local newsagents, fully intent on getting, say, bananas or apples, but coming out with the chocolate bar instead. But just to provide some sort of evidence that this isn't just my experience, but might be a slightly more widespread phenomenon, I can show you this graph, which is going to look at the intensity of Google searches over time for the word diet. And to provide a benchmark, I'll first put up how often it's searched in January. So this is a relatively high number of searches. But then over the course of each year, you see a dip, and then rise again for January and dip. So everyone's really interested in dieting in January. But as the year continues, people lose interest. This certainly provides some sort of potential evidence or suggestive evidence that actually people are making all sorts of commitments early on in the year which they're struggling to stick to as the year progresses. Another reason why people might not take in all the costs and benefits of their decisions into account is because actually they don't face those costs and benefits. So I suggested earlier that people make decisions by weighing up the costs and benefits. What I didn't say is actually the relevant costs and benefits are those to themselves, not to other people. That's because there's no reason why they need to take into account the costs imposed on other people. And in the case of our decisions over what to eat, the most obvious costs created for other people are healthcare costs. And in the UK, the annual cost of treating obesity and overweight-related diseases is £6 billion. And because we've got a publicly funded health service in the form of the NHS, this isn't a cost that the individual faces, but it's rather a cost to society as a whole. It's funded by the taxpayer. So we've seen that we've discussed the first question, but before I proceed on to the second, I'm going to do a quick recap. And these are kind of some true or false questions, and if you agree with them, it'd be great if you put your hand up, and if you disagree, you can keep it down. So firstly, if people are fully informed, bear all the costs of their decisions, and do not suffer from lapses in self-control, they will be in the best position to weigh up the costs and benefits of what they eat. What do you think? If you agree, put your hand up. Yeah, I agree with you. Secondly, there is evidence that people don't always take all the costs into account, be that cost to themselves or cost to other people. Yeah, again, I would say this is true. Thirdly, therefore, there is a justification for policy influencing these choices. What do we think? So I think this is a bit unfair of me to put this question up, partly because I don't think I've yet given you enough information to answer this question. So instead, I'm going to put up a more qualified statement. Therefore, there might be a justification for policy influencing these choices. This will depend on whether policy can help us weigh up the costs and benefits of what we eat better than we would in its absence. So let's consider this last question. Can policy achieve this? And I'm going to suggest there are a number of criteria that policy must fulfill in order to do this well. Firstly, it must address the reason why people aren't taking certain costs into account. It must minimize the effects on people who are taking all the costs into account. And it must also take into account how people respond, as well as any other undesirable effects. And we can apply this framework to kind of any of the policies that we mentioned earlier. But to bring each of these out, I'm going to focus first on the soft drinks levy. So to provide a bit of background on this policy, it was introduced about 2 years ago. It's a tax on unhealthy soft drinks. So that's drinks containing added sugar. It doesn't apply to other unhealthy products, so it doesn't apply to chocolate, sweets, or crisps, and doesn't apply to diet varieties of drinks either. So your Diet Coke is tax-free, or also to milkshakes. So what is the idea behind this policy? How does it address the fact that people are not taking certain costs into account? Well, the idea is that by directly increasing one of the costs that people are good at taking into account, the price, you can get them to make the decisions that they would make if they were taking all the costs into account. But to do this, you can't just set the tax at any old rate, but rather it has to be quite thought through. And economic theory tells us that the tax should be set equal to the monetary value of ignored costs. That might sound a bit abstract to those of you who have never come across this before. So to clarify it a bit, let's return to our example of Homer. So remember Homer's choosing between an apple and a donut, and that if he was to take all the relevant factors into account, how much he enjoys the donuts, the fact that they're bad for him, as well as the price difference between the products, he'd go for the apple. But also remember that Homer didn't go to biology class. He doesn't know that donuts are bad for him, and that when he ignores that, his decision goes the other way. He goes for the donut. The role for policy here is to help him make the decision he would make if he was taking all of these facts into account, in particular, the health consequence. And the way that the tax achieves this is by increasing the price of the donut in such a way that the scales tip to the place they would if he was taking into account the costs. And that's what we mean by the monetary value of the ignored cost. The ignored cost in this case being the fact that donuts are bad for him. So this all seems relatively simple then. But unfortunately, the world isn't quite as simple as I've painted it today. Firstly, there's huge uncertainty about the size of these ignored costs, and estimating them is challenging. And if the tax is set too high, that has costs too, insofar as it also alters how people weigh up the costs and benefits of their decision, leading them to overweight the costs. There's also a further challenge, insofar as the ignored costs vary across people, but everyone typically pays the same tax rate. This is kind of intuitive. Imagine you've got a committed marathon runner and a guy who sits on the sofa every evening. The health consequences to them of eating a thing of Coke is probably rather different. For the committed marathon runner, they're probably minimal, whereas for the guy sat on the sofa, they might be larger. In this case, the ignored costs are also going to be lower for the committed marathon runner, but these guys face the same tax. There's no way of setting a 2p tax for the committed marathon runner and a 10p tax for the other guy. So this presents a challenge for policymakers. They want to help the guy on your right to take into account all the costs of his decision, but they don't want to distort the decisions of the marathon runner. In order to do this, policymakers try and target products which are particularly consumed by people who aren't taking costs into account and aren't particularly consumed by other groups in society. And actually, the soft drinks tax does this relatively well. The two groups we might think of particularly ignoring costs of their consumption are probably children and those with already very unhealthy diets. Children, we think, because firstly, they're going to live longer and have longer for the costs to accrue over, but also because they might lack information and also be more likely to experience self-control problems. And those with existing bad diets, because we tend to think that actually the costs of a bad diet are cumulative rather than increasing straight. And actually, these are the same groups that we see who do consume more soft drinks. So we've seen that actually taxes is one way that you can get people to take account of the costs of their decisions over what to eat. We've also seen that the soft drinks tax is pretty well targeted at the groups you might be particularly concerned about and does quite well at minimising the costs it imposes on other groups in society. But as with any other policy, we also want to consider, does the policy have any other undesirable consequences? So we want to think about these too. So any consequences beyond altering how people weigh up the costs and benefits of their decisions. And these could support the end that the tax is trying to achieve, or they could undermine the policy. And in the case of the soft drinks tax, we see a bit of both. So probably the most obvious response to the soft drinks tax has been that the manufacturers have responded by reducing the sugar content in their products. All else being equal, this seems like a pretty good thing, if people continue to enjoy their soft drinks just as much as they were before, they've now got less sugar in it. The health consequences of them are lower. They're still getting all the same benefits, but the costs that they were facing have now reduced. The only problem arises is if you think that reformulation of products actually alters the product in such a way that people don't enjoy it anymore. And this is what we saw in the case of Iron Brew. With the fans demanding a return to the original recipe, they were pretty distraught with the actual change, to the extent that Iron Brew almost went under and have now responded by increasing a product which is even more sugary than the original product was. So this certainly seems to undermine the policy. The degree to which this is going to be a problem is going to depend on how big a response this is. So if most reformulations actually leave people still enjoying the product and not really noticing the difference, then that seems like a win. But if many people actually have products which they were previously enjoying removed from their choice set, then actually that's a problem. But we don't just care about how manufacturers respond, we also care about how individuals respond. So I said earlier that the tax is going to alter the way that people weigh up the costs and benefits of consuming a certain drink. So in this case, let's consider a Fanta. And if they choose to, instead of drinking a Fanta, to drink, say, water, then this is all well and good. Because we tend to think that when people consume water, they're probably still weighing up all the costs and benefits of that decision too. But if, however, they respond by consuming another untaxed good, which actually also has costs which they're not properly taking into account weighed up, such as a milkshake, which is exempt from the tax, then actually this just has the effect of moving the cost they were ignoring from one decision to another. This might not be that big a problem if people aren't very inclined to switch from a soft drink to a milkshake, if they're much more inclined to switch to water every time. But in order to understand whether or not the policy is going to be effective or is going to be undermined in this way, we need to understand how likely people are to switch from one product to another. And this is where research could be really valuable. Another concern that is often raised in the context of the soft drinks tax is that it hits those on low-income households the hardest. And actually, this was a relatively live part of the recent Conservative leadership debate, with Boris Johnson declaring that he would halt the expansion of sin stealth taxes until a wide-ranging review could be carried out into whether they are effective or whether they hit the poorest consumers hardest. And this is a well-founded concern, insofar as low-income households do spend more on soft drinks. However, we've also seen that these are the groups among which obesity is highest. And if we think this is driven by people not properly weighing up the costs and benefits of their decisions, then actually this is the group among which there's also the greatest scope for gain from them properly weighing up these decisions. So perhaps a better question is, can the concerns that soft drinks hit low-income households the hardest be addressed in other ways? Are there other parts of the tax and benefit system or other policy levers we can use to support low-income households while still maintaining the soft drinks tax as a way of helping people weigh up the decisions better? And one way that's sometimes posited is actually just redirecting the revenue raised from the soft drinks tax into supporting low-income households. Okay, so to just run over the key principles that we've kind of drawn out by looking at the soft drinks tax, we've seen that all policy should address the reason why people aren't taking costs into account. It should minimise the effects on people who are taking all the costs into account, and should also take account of how people respond, as well as any undesirable effects. And we can apply these to each of the policies, although we've considered just the soft drinks tax now. So to kind of wrap up, should the government try and influence what we eat? Well, we've seen that policy can be justified if it helps people to weigh up the costs and benefits of their decision. We've also seen that poorly designed policy could actually do more damage than good. And that could be if it distorts the decisions of people who are taking all the costs into account, or if it does not take account of how individuals and firm behaviour might actually undermine the aim of the policy in the first place. And I'm going to suggest this doesn't mean we shouldn't use policy, but rather that it just needs to be implemented intelligently if we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're happy to take some questions. Or rather, Rebecca is happy to take some questions. Don't ask me.
You're welcome to answer them too.
So Ralph has a microphone.
Now we're going. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So are there any questions? So who's first? No one has a question? Oh, yes.
Do you think the sugar tax should be applied to all products, or would you agree differently to that?
By all products, do you mean all sugary products?
Yeah, pretty much.
So I think the real core of this answer is going to come down to the targeting argument. So we discussed kind of how the soft drinks tax actually is targeted quite well at people who already aren't taking account of all the costs and benefits of their decision, but does minimise effects of people who aren't. So things like fruit contain sugar. And if they're consumed by people who really are weighing up the costs and benefits of their decision, then do we really want to distort that? Also, I guess one of the key things I wanted you to take away from the talk is actually if Beyonce had ended up going for the donut, as she did, and if she'd ended up having some sort of health complications, that was kind of completely fine, but she'd weighed up the costs and benefits of her decision. So I would say, no, I wouldn't suggest that it should be extended.
So could it be argued that some people may weigh up the costs and benefits along with the price and everything involved and still go for the more unhealthy good because they prefer it? That you could argue that the individual weighing up all the benefits and cons isn't enough, that you need a body that's a bit more has more control than someone's inhibitions. So could you argue that in that case government intervention is more necessary in other areas?
So you're saying if they are properly weighing up all the costs or if they're not properly weighing up all the costs?
If they are weighing up everything and they still decide to go to KFC,
Yeah.
even though they know it's bad for them and it might be more expensive, they just prefer it.
Yeah.
Which is the case in a lot of scenarios.
So economists typically think that's a good thing. I mean, from a concern of, so we tend to think individuals are concerned with maximising basically how well off they are, what we tend to refer to as welfare in economics. And insofar as they're people who are willing to deal with the fact they're really expensive and there are health consequences, if they're taking all the costs into account, then these are also people who get loads of benefit from KFC. They really love KFC, they really enjoy it. So it's a good thing that made the right decision from that perspective.
Do you know that when you said for like fizzy drinks, they reduce sugar, but then don't they add like artificial sweeteners? Isn't that just as bad for your health? So
I'm not a public health person. I don't know the medical evidence there. The idea is that sugar is particularly bad, so they're trying to, and people don't properly weigh up the costs and benefits of consuming sugar. I think the understanding is actually that the health, or the rationale is that the health consequences associated with diet products isn't as bad. I'm assuming that's the rationale, but I don't know the medical evidence on that. But that would be the kind of rationale that would make sense. Yeah.
By putting the sugar tax, for example, into consideration, doesn't that implicitly give information that could be potentially bad for candidates who have not been previously taking that into account? And therefore, is there potential that you're over-skewing the decision-making by putting a tax on?
So I think one of the key mechanisms by which the soft drinks has worked, at least elsewhere, and there's kind of evidence looking at similar taxes in other countries, is by providing information. So people have studied that by looking at how people respond actually when a tax is announced before it's even implemented, and you see a change in purchases even then, because it's kind of provided the information without actually having the tax. I'm not sure about whether or not then you're over-skewing, insofar as you still think people are failing to take costs into account and that it's well targeted, then it's probably quite well designed. If you think, so I guess the challenge comes down to we actually don't really know very much about the size of the costs that people aren't taking into account. So when governments set policy at these rates, they're not necessarily setting it at in the precise way to actually get people to perfectly take these costs into account. What they're kind of basing it on is, we know these costs are probably quite large. We think that actually behaviour needs to be altered in some sort of way to get them to take into account, and this is probably a move in the right direction. You would be right in saying that if they were perfectly set to perfectly capture, then people were taking some portion of that into account, they would then be overset. But I think probably in reality, that's not the case, if that's clear.
Could you give a comment perhaps about where costs are on a kind of longer time scale? So thinking perhaps changing food labelling to reflect carbon emissions. So where the costs are perhaps not as directly on ourselves, but perhaps more on our children in terms of the impacts of climate change. And yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is probably a more challenging question, but relates probably more closely to the case in which people aren't taking into account costs on other people. So in this context, we only consider health consequences, but you're right to point out that there might be other consequences to other people. And in the same way, policies such as taxes can be used to get people to take these costs into account. There's a separate question about actually what you think the relevant costs are and over how many generations those should be counted, and those come down to value judgments ultimately. And those aren't kind of the things that we kind of stick to and think lots about, but yeah.
You have time to think about more questions.
So you root your answer to the government question quite heavily in the individual, and the individual having responsibility to decide, or freedom to decide. But at the same time, you mentioned that people who have bad diets when they're kids have bad diets when they're older, which suggests to me that we don't necessarily have that freedom of choice that you rooted your answer in.
So I think I would try and move away from the question about freedom of choice. I think in trying to improve the information they have for which to make the decision, that's exactly the sort of thing that, say, labelling policy or education policy is targeted at. I think it becomes a bit more tricky if you think that habits are built as you grow up, and very much what you eat as an adult is a result of what you ate as a child, and also how much you enjoy given things is a result of what you were exposed to as a child. If you think that's the case, then there's probably an argument for actually exposing people to a real wide range of food as a child, be that through educational policies or cooking classes in school, but that certainly is a more challenging area.
I'm concerned as to the extent to which the government is concerned about putting in policy for welfare's sake rather than for political sake. So in the 1970s, there was a U.S. Senate committee that promoted the public to switch to low-fat, high-carb diets instead of just the usual balanced fat-carb diet. And this resulted in a lot more people becoming obese. And they were using medical evidence to show that a low-fat diet was actually more healthy. And as we know now, carbohydrates and sugar, more specifically, is the main culprit of obesity. And so it would seem that policy was quite politically motivated rather than actually being welfare-based.
I mean, I can't really speak to their motivation. Certainly, from the point that they're providing misinformation, then that's not going to be beneficial for promoting welfare, because it means that people can't properly take the costs and benefits of their decision into account. Insofar as policy does want to promote welfare, then they should be providing correct information, not misinformation. But you're right to suggest that sometimes there is a gap between what economists would think good policy design and what might motivate politicians in cases.
Do you think it's more food insecurity or lack of education amongst the poor communities that's actually causing them to make these choices?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. And I think there are probably a couple of things wrapped up there. So by food insecurity, are you kind of thinking the fact that unhealthy food is typically cheaper, or also access to food, or?
Just kind of people who have a set meal for the next time, they tend to over-consume during the moment. I mean, it's not a study in the US found that there's actually kind of a correlation between food insecurity and obesity, although it's kind of a paradox.
So I haven't looked at that evidence, but if you were in a case where you're concerned about when your next meal is coming, then the costs and benefits that you're kind of weighing up, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. So it will mean that you make decisions kind of hedging different risks and perhaps there are lots of different factors wrapped up there. I think there's also quite a bit of evidence that people who actually are in poverty and experiencing a lot of stress associated with that struggle from cognitive overload, which is actually your brain's filled with about a whole load of other things, and it's really hard to process the information even if you have it, which could lead you to making decisions which, even though you know this isn't your best interest or like you have access to all the information, you just occupied by a billion other things. So that could also be driving it. So from that perspective, policies lifting people out of poverty and supporting that from that perspective could actually be more effective in getting them to make good decisions over what to eat than other policies.
I wonder if you think there's a case for government intervention. So you're assuming that someone has all information and that they can weigh up all the costs and benefits sufficiently, but because of, for example, a budget constraint, they can't actually make the choice they would want to make. So, for example, if we assume there was a world where the only product we could buy was chicken Kievs, and chicken Kiev isn't a regulated term, you'd assume the less chicken is in the product, the cheaper it is to buy. Now, someone may want to buy a high-quality chicken Kiev with around 50% meat, but can only afford something with, say, 10% meat. And as much as they would like to, buy the healthy meal, they cannot because of their own budget constraint, because they're broke. So do you think there's a role for government policy through either regulation or through redistribution to kind of enable great choice in that sense?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Some colleagues of mine actually did a piece of research which tried to get at this question, looking actually at how big a fact prices and your amount of income were in the decisions over what you ate. And they looked at this by looking at how food and drink purchases changed over the recession when people had quite big changes to their income. And what they found is that actually when people's incomes changed, over the time period that they were considering, actually, although the amount that people spent on food changed quite a lot, the healthiness of their diet didn't really. It might have changed slightly in composition. People might have switched between different products, so had slightly more grainy-based diets when they previously were eating more meat. But actually, if you kind of index it up into a health index, they were eating roughly about as healthily as they were before, despite changes in income and the amount of resources. So I think there's some evidence, at least suggestive, that that's not that big a factor in practice. But if that was binding, then it would certainly be something that policymakers would have to think about.
Hi, so we've had the sugar tax for 2 years. How much tax revenue has it raised, and has it reduced consumption of sugary drinks?
Oh, I have no idea about the first question. I definitely should know the answer to that. What I do know is it's raised substantially less than they kind of anticipated, partly because products have been reformulated so they no longer have to pay the tax. Your second question, I think, was, has it been effective?
Has it reduced consumption of sugar drinks?
Yeah. So there's not really been any big-scale research projects looking at the UK tax yet, partly because it's still relatively recent. Me and my colleagues actually did a piece of research looking at sugar taxes elsewhere. So there have been about 50 taxes applied elsewhere in the world. And the evidence suggests certainly that they have been quite effective. Exactly how effective depends on a number of things, such as what products they apply to, how big they are, as well as the kind of geographical jurisdiction they're applied to. So it suggests they would be effective in the UK, but we don't really know yet.
So your argument is that policy is good if it helps people evaluate the pros and cons of consuming sugary goods, for example. But surely aren't people irrational and make irrational decisions? So the effectiveness of a policy isn't actually that effective because people will continue to make irrational decisions even if the costs of consuming a highly sugary drink are negative.
So I think I mean, I'm not going to speak to people's rationality or irrationality. What I was more considering is reasons why people might not take things into account. So I guess the one you're probably driving at that we considered here is that people might experience temptation or lapses in self-control, in which case there's actually very specific policies which can probably help people help people make those decisions, such as removing those sources of self-control. So probably the most obvious cases are having, say, chocolate by counters. A number of supermarkets have now banned these voluntarily, so there's no actual government policy mandating it, but the big ones, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, have all banned it in the big supermarkets. And the idea of these policies is actually, if you really want a chocolate bar, you can still go go get one. It's still in the supermarket. But by removing it from by the counter, you're reducing the source of temptation. And actually those kind of impulse buys, which we think might result from people not properly taking all the costs into account in that moment and experiencing that temptation, while still being able to buy it if they actually do really want it and they want to go hunting for it.
Would you think that even if you might prevent impulse buys from buying chocolate, for example, that people who still desire chocolate will continue to buy, irrespective of the policy?
It's quite plausible, yes. But it's very difficult to disentangle whether or not people actually want it because they are properly taking all the costs into account, or whether or not they're not properly taking the costs into account. I guess you can target people who have probably the behaviour which is most easy to alter, such as the people who are buying it just because it's next to the counter. You can also try and use policies which actually might target the reason why people are experiencing those self-control problems in the first place. So one thing which is sometimes claimed is that advertising is partly to blame for people really wanting certain products more than they, like it kind of distorts how much they actually want something, in which case banning advertising on unhealthy food targeted at particular groups in the population that we might think struggle with that could be one way of doing that.
Do you think that the government could use an alternative strategy like nudge theory to influence people's choices to buy healthier food? For example, using framing or anchoring of a product to sway people rather than just using tax to change their choices.
Oh, I didn't hear your last question, sorry. Your last sentence.
By using framing or anchoring of a product to sway people into buying a product rather than just using tax.
Yeah, so I mean, I know I focused in tax in the presentation, but as I mentioned, there are a number of other policies people can introduce. And I guess, for example, the removing of chocolate from the counter very much is a kind of nudge policy. The idea behind, so tax is particularly well suited to cases where people aren't taking into account costs imposed on other people. That's because they directly make them costs which you have to deal with rather than costs to other people. You're very right to point out that there could be other ways of targeting policies which actually are due to costs that you're not taking into account, and quite possibly like nudge policies could be quite effective.
Okay, I think is there a further question? No. In which case, thank you very much, Rebekah. That was great. I'd like to thank a few people actually. I'd like to thank Vic in the corner here and Ralph here for organising today, and the organisers involved, Josephina and others. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you lot for coming along and listening and asking sensible questions. At no time did I have to say, "Where's your question?" which is nice. And of course, I'd like to thank very much Rebekah for coming along and speaking to us today and providing us with, I think, what you'll agree is some food for thought. Yeah.
Oh, I should use that.
Yeah. Thank you.